Before humanity had fire under control, before we understood the sky, there was one moment that changed everything. A flash split the darkness without warning. The ground didn't just light up, it answered back with fire. And for the first humans who saw it, the sky was no longer empty. It was alive. They didn't know what electricity was. They didn't know what storms were. They only knew one thing: something above them had the power to strike the earth in an instant. And that moment became fear, memory, and the beginning of every story we would one day tell about the sky. If you're drawn to ancient mysteries, lost worlds, and the strange origins of human fear, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because what happened after that first strike is even more unsettling than the moment itself. Storm over early human world. The world is not yet divided into maps, nations, or even stable seasons that can be trusted. It is a world of pressure and silence, broken suddenly by movement in the sky that early humans cannot name. Across vast stretches of raw landscape, dense forests that seem to breathe in fog, open plains rolling like frozen waves, and river valleys cutting through stone, small human groups live close to the ground, always attentive to what the environment might do next. Above them, the sky is not a backdrop. It is a living presence, unstable and indifferent, capable of shifting from calm brightness to something far more violent in the span of moments. Before any understanding of electricity, before any concept of atmospheric charge or weather systems, there is only observation. And in those observations, lightning appears as one of the most disorienting experiences early humans ever witness. It does not behave like fire on the ground. It does not travel like animals or spread like wind. It arrives without warning, as if the sky itself has torn open for an instant. A brilliant fracture of light cuts through the air, followed by a sound that arrives too late, like the world correcting itself after a mistake. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. For early humans, there is no separation between event and meaning. When lightning strikes a tree and splits it into burning fragments, the image is not just destruction, it is intent, because nothing in their experience suggests randomness of that scale. The world they inhabit is full of causes they can see animals hunt. Rivers carve stone slowly. Fire spreads when touched. Lightning, however, violates all of these expectations. It acts without touch, without approach, without warning. In the earliest landscapes that archaeologists and anthropologists attempt to reconstruct deep in the Pleistocene world, where Homo sapiens are still forming cultural continuity and other human relatives still exist in overlapping territories, storms would have been more than occasional disruptions. Climate systems of the time were often more volatile than modern patterns, with shifting ice ages and regional instability producing intense weather fronts. In such environments, thunderstorms could erupt with sudden force, especially in regions where warm air masses collided with cold, dense atmospheric layers. Lightning would have been frequent in certain corridors of land, particularly near coasts, highlands, and forest edges. To modern science, lightning is the result of charge separation within storm clouds, a natural discharge between cloud and ground or between clouds themselves. But none of this exists in early perception. Instead, what survives in the archaeological imagination is something far more immediate: the sense of sky aggression. A strike that splits stone or ignites dry vegetation would have appeared not as physics, but as an act of overwhelming power descending from above. Human groups at this stage are small, mobile, and highly dependent on environmental reading. They track animal movement, plant cycles, and water availability with precision shaped by survival pressure. Yet the sky remains the least controllable domain. When storms gather, there is little they can do except seek cover under rock overhangs, dense tree canopies, or shallow cave entrances. Even these shelters offer no real protection from lightning's reach. In fact, high trees often used as temporary shelter become some of the most dangerous points in the landscape during a storm. The earliest encounters with lightning likely occur not as isolated events, but as repeated experiences across generations. A group witnesses a strike that kills a tree. Years later, another group experiences fire spreading through a valley after a storm. Over time, these moments accumulate into memory patterns. Even without language capable of abstract explanation, repetition builds recognition. Storms bring danger from above, and that danger is unpredictable. There is a subtle but important detail in how early humans might have interpreted these events. Unlike modern observers who separate natural phenomena into categories, early cognition likely blended cause and agency. Lightning would not be it. It would be something. Something that acts, something that chooses, something that arrives with intention too complex to understand. This distinction matters because it lays the groundwork for later spiritual frameworks across cultures. Meanwhile, the environment itself reinforces the impression of violence. When lightning strikes dry forests during warm seasons, it can ignite large fires that move quickly through vegetation. Even in wetter climates, a single strike can split a tree, sending burning fragments outward. The sound that follows thunder would be especially significant. It arrives delayed, stretching perception across distance, creating the impression that the sky speaks after it acts. For early humans, this delay would not reduce fear, it would deepen it, as if the sky's voice is only fully heard after the damage is already done. Archaeological evidence does not preserve moments of fear directly, but it does preserve consequence. Burn layers in ancient soil deposits show repeated fire events long before controlled use of fire becomes widespread. Some of these fires are consistent with natural ignition sources, and lightning is among the most plausible explanations. In certain sediment layers, charcoal distribution suggests widespread burning that does not match human fire management patterns, implying environmental ignition rather than deliberate human activity. Yet even this evidence is fragmentary. Scholars still debate how often lightning versus volcanic activity or other natural causes contributed to early fire landscapes. What remains consistent is the recognition that fire appears in the human story before it is fully controlled, and lightning is one of the few natural forces capable of delivering it directly from the sky. Within this early world, survival depends on reading danger quickly. Over time, humans may begin to associate certain visual cues with approaching storm shifts in wind direction, changes in animal behavior, the darkening of cloud formations that roll in from distant horizons. But lightning itself offers no warning pattern that can be reliably decoded at first. It is instantaneous, making it one of the most psychologically disruptive natural events in the early human environment. And so, in this storm-shaped world, the sky becomes something more than atmosphere. It becomes a boundary of uncertainty. Every group living under it develops an awareness that above them lies a force that cannot be negotiated with, only endured. Lightning, in its first appearances in human experience, is not just light or fire or sound. It is the moment when the sky reveals it can act with absolute independence. When sky first turned violent, the memory of calm weather in the early human world is never stable. Even when the sky appears still, there is always a sense that it is only resting, not harmless. Across prehistoric landscapes, weather is experienced as something that arrives rather than something that simply exists. It moves in, dominates the horizon, and then withdraws, leaving altered ground behind. Among these shifts, thunderstorms stand out not only for their rarity in some regions, but for their overwhelming intensity when they do appear. In the deep prehistoric environment, especially during the late Pleistocene, climate systems are not uniform. Glacial cycles reshape wind patterns, moisture levels, and temperature gradients across continents. In some regions, this produces long periods of stability. In others, it creates unstable atmospheric collisions where warm and cold air masses meet with force. These conditions are ideal for the formation of towering cumulonimbus clouds, structures that rise like dark mountains into the upper atmosphere. To early humans, such formations would not resemble anything familiar on the ground. They would appear as vertical distortions of the sky itself, growing denser, darker, and more threatening as they approach. Lightning emerges from these systems not as a frequent background occurrence, but as a dramatic punctuation. It does not belong to the everyday rhythm of survival in the way rain or wind does. Instead, it interrupts it. A group may be traveling along a riverbank or gathering resources in open woodland when the first signs appear: a distant dimming of light, an unnatural stillness among animals, and a pressure in the air that seems to compress sound. Then, without transition, the sky fractures. The first violent strikes are not just visually overwhelming, they are physically disruptive. A single bolt can split trees, ignite dry grass, or shatter stone surfaces exposed at the right angle. In environments shaped by lightning-prone ecosystems such as savannas, open woodlands, and mountainous ridges, these strikes can reshape micro-landscapes repeatedly over time. Even today, ecologists recognize lightning as a key natural ignition source in many fire-adapted ecosystems. For early humans, however, there is no ecological framework, there is only event and aftermath. What makes lightning especially disturbing in this phase of human experience is its lack of preparation time. Unlike predators that announce themselves through movement or sound, lightning arrives without a perceptible lead. The flash is instantaneous. The sound follows too slowly to be connected in real time. This separation between sight and sound would have created a deeply disorienting sensory gap. The world appears to react twice to the same moment, as if reality itself is slightly out of alignment. Early human cognition, shaped by survival needs, tends to assume that repeated events have causes that can be understood or anticipated. But lightning resists this expectation. A storm may pass without a strike, or it may produce multiple strikes within minutes. There is no visible pattern in early observation that would allow prediction. Over generations, this unpredictability becomes one of its most defining traits. In some reconstructed anthropological models, early humans may have associated violent sky events with emotional states of the environment itself. This is not superstition in the modern sense, but a form of pattern recognition applied to incomplete information. When a tree is struck and burns rapidly, it is not unreasonable within that cognitive framework to interpret the sky as active rather than inert. The distinction between natural process and intentional force has not yet fully separated in human thought. Animal behavior intensifies this impression. Long before humans understand atmospheric science, they observe that animals react to storms in ways that suggest awareness. Herds of grazing animals become restless before lightning storms. Birds shift flight patterns or seek dense cover, Larger mammals may retreat toward valleys or sheltered terrain. These behaviors, driven by sensitivity to atmospheric pressure changes and low-frequency sound waves, become early warning systems for humans. Even if the underlying cause is not understood, one lesser-known detail in modern ecological research is that lightning-generated infrasound and electromagnetic disturbances can be detected by some species well before the visible strike occurs. While early humans would not have understood these mechanisms, they would have seen the results: animals reacting before the sky visibly changes. This reinforces the idea that something unseen is already in motion. As lightning storms repeat across generations, human groups begin to develop behavioral adaptations. Camps are less frequently placed beneath tall, isolated trees. Open ridges may be avoided during certain seasonal periods when storms become more frequent. Sheltered rock formations gain importance not only for protection from rain, but from something far more dangerous coming from above. These are not formalized rules, but accumulated habits, transmitted through observation and imitation. There is also evidence inferred from later behavioral patterns of hunter-gatherer societies that early humans develop a heightened attentiveness to environmental cues preceding storms. Subtle shifts in wind direction, changes in cloud texture, and sudden quieting of animal movement all become meaningful signals. Lightning itself remains unpredictable, but the storm system surrounding it becomes increasingly readable. Yet despite growing awareness of storm conditions, the moment of lightning strike remains fundamentally uncontrollable. This is what gives it its enduring psychological weight. It is not simply dangerous, it is autonomous. It does not negotiate distance. It does not require proximity. It does not announce intention. It simply happens. In regions where lightning strikes repeatedly ignite fires, early humans may begin to encounter another layer of consequence. Fire, once it spreads, transforms landscapes in ways both destructive and unexpectedly beneficial. Burned areas attract new plant growth over time, and animals often return to graze on regrowth. Without understanding ecological cycles, early humans may still notice that fire reshapes hunting opportunities and resource distribution. Lightning, then, becomes indirectly linked not only to fear but to environmental change. However, this duality is not yet conceptualized. At this stage, lightning is still overwhelmingly associated with danger. Its violence defines its identity, and in the absence of control or explanation, the sky itself becomes a source of enduring uncertainty, a space where the rules of the ground no longer apply. Fireless minds and fearful skies. Before fire becomes a constant companion in human life, the world feels fundamentally unfinished. Light comes from the sun, warmth from bodies and shelter, and night arrives as an absolute condition rather than something that can be resisted. In this fireless stage, early humans exist in a sensory environment where transformation is rare and uncontrollable. Materials do not change state in predictable ways within their control. Wood does not become flame unless something extraordinary happens. And when it does, the result is as startling as it is dangerous. In this context, lightning occupies a position that modern cognition struggles to fully reconstruct. It is not just a natural event, it is a violation of expectation. A tree stands for decades, sometimes centuries, growing slowly in silence. Then, in an instant, a strike from the sky can erase it, leaving behind burning fragments or a split trunk exposed like an open wound in the landscape. For a mind that has no tool to replicate such transformation at will, the implication is profound. Something in the sky possesses a power entirely outside human reach. Fire itself, when encountered naturally, is likely first experienced through lightning strikes igniting dry vegetation. This means that for long stretches of early human history, fire is not a tool but a consequence. It arrives uninvited, it spreads unpredictably, it consumes landscapes with a speed that outpaces human response. Only later does controlled fire emerge, but in this earlier phase, fire is inseparable from the violence of its origin. It is skyborne. This association shapes perception deeply. Lightning and fire are not separate phenomena in early cognition. They are two stages of the same event. The sky acts, and the ground responds in flame. The distance between cause and effect is immediate enough to be observed but not understood in mechanistic terms. There is no concept of electricity, no understanding of heat transfer or combustion chemistry. There is only the visible chain of destruction. Archaeological interpretation of early fire use suggests that natural fires likely predate controlled fire by hundreds of thousands of years. Sites associated with early hominins show evidence of burned material, but distinguishing between natural ignition such as lightning and deliberate fire management remains one of the most debated topics in paleoanthropology. Some evidence suggests opportunistic use of naturally occurring fire before full control is established. Lightning would have been a primary source of such ignition events in many environments. What matters in this phase is not technical understanding but emotional imprint. The sky becomes associated with sudden transformation. A calm horizon can become violent without warning. This unpredictability creates a cognitive environment where anticipation is always present, even in moments of apparent safety. The fear of the sky is not constant panic, but a background condition of awareness. Early humans likely develop a sensitivity to atmospheric change that operates below conscious thought. A slight darkening of distant clouds, a shift in wind direction, or a change in animal behavior can trigger movement toward shelter. Over time, these reactions become refined survival strategies, but their origin lies in repeated exposure to events like lightning strikes that demand immediate response. One particularly striking aspect of lightning in fireless environments is its ability to redefine spatial understanding. In a world without artificial light, darkness is not just absence but totality. When lightning flashes, it briefly reveals the landscape in extreme clarity: trees, rocks, distant ridges, only to erase it again in darkness. This intermittent illumination creates a fragmented visual memory of space. The world is seen in sudden, violent snapshots. Modern neuroscience suggests that intermittent sensory events can produce stronger memory encoding than continuous stimuli. While early humans could not conceptualize this, the effect would have been real lightning storms leave lasting impressions not just because of danger, but because of how they momentarily restructure perception itself. There is also the matter of sound. Thunder follows lightning, but never in perfect synchrony. This delay creates a perceptual disconnect that is difficult to interpret without scientific framing. The sky appears to act silently, then speak afterward. For early minds, this could easily be interpreted as delayed communication rather than physical consequence. The sky does something, and only later announces it. In environments where storms are frequent, these sensory disruptions accumulate into a recognizable pattern of instability. Groups learn that certain atmospheric conditions precede periods of heightened risk. Warm, humid air rising over cooler terrain can produce conditions ripe for thunderstorms. While early humans do not understand these dynamics, they learn to recognize their effects. In some regions, Lightning may even become a seasonal expectation rather than a rare anomaly. During certain climatic phases, storm activity increases, particularly in transitional zones between ecosystems' forest edges, river basins, and elevated plains. These are also regions heavily used by early human groups for resources, increasing the likelihood of encounters with lightning events. What is often overlooked in modern interpretations is how deeply such events shape spatial behavior. Avoidance of open high ground during storm seasons, preference for sheltered valleys, and careful timing of movement between locations may all be influenced by repeated lightning exposure. Over generations, these behaviors become embedded in cultural practice, even if the original cause is no longer explicitly remembered. Despite all adaptations, the core experience remains unchanged. Lightning cannot be negotiated with. It does not respond to distance, caution, or awareness. It bypasses all behavioral strategies. This is what gives it enduring psychological weight in early human experience. Unlike predators, droughts, or cold seasons, lightning is instantaneous and absolute. In this fireless world, where transformation is rare and largely uncontrollable, lightning stands as one of the earliest forces to demonstrate that the environment can change reality in a single moment. It does not simply threaten survival. It redefines what survival means in the first place. The first recorded strikes in memory. Long before anything resembling written history, memory itself becomes the first archive of human experience. In small, mobile groups scattered across vast prehistoric landscapes, knowledge survives only through repetition, through stories told around fading fires, through gestures repeated during storms, through the careful imitation of behavior that once meant survival. Lightning, in this fragile system of transmission, becomes one of the most persistently remembered forces in the early human world. There is no record in the modern sense, but there is pattern recognition stretched across generations. A child grows up hearing that when the sky darkens in a certain way, the group moves quickly toward shelter. An elder remembers a tree that once stood near a river bend before it was split and burned after a storm. Another remembers animals scattering in panic before a sudden flash. These fragments accumulate into shared awareness, not as structured knowledge, but as lived caution. What makes lightning unique in this memory system is its clarity of impact. Many natural events are gradual rivers change course slowly. Seasons shift predictably. Animals migrate in cycles. Lightning, however, leaves immediate and visible consequences that endure long after the storm passes. A burned patch of forest, a shattered trunk or scorched ground becomes a landmark. These physical traces serve as anchors for memory, reinforcing the association between sky and sudden destruction. In some regions, especially those with frequent storm activity, these memories may become spatially embedded. A valley where lightning once ignited a fire becomes a place avoided during certain weather conditions. A ridge where strikes are common becomes associated with danger even when skies are clear. Over time, geography itself begins to carry meaning shaped by atmospheric violence. Archaeological evidence indirectly supports this kind of environmental memory. Charcoal deposits in the ancient sediment layers show repeated burning events across long time scales, often without signs of human ignition. While not all of these can be attributed to lightning, many are consistent with natural fire cycles in ecosystems prone to electrical storms. In these landscapes, fire is not rare. It is a recurring force shaping ecological succession long before human control becomes dominant. Yet the question of how early humans interpreted these events remains open. Some scholars suggest that early cognitive frameworks likely did not separate cause and intention. A lightning strike that destroys a tree is not simply an event, it is an action. Something has done this. The identity of that something is undefined, but its presence is implied by repetition. If it happens again and again across generations, it must be part of the world's structure, even if invisible. This leads to one of the most important psychological developments in early human experience, the formation of persistent sky-based causality. The sky is no longer just space above the ground. It becomes a domain of agency. Rain, wind, and lightning are not random. They are expressions of forces that operate beyond human reach. Lightning, in particular, stands out because of its visual intensity and destructive immediacy. It is the clearest expression of sky agency. In this stage of development, memory does not distinguish between scientific explanation and emotional interpretation. A lightning strike remembered by one generation is retold not as a meteorological event, but as something that came from above and burned the land. Over time, such phrasing may evolve into symbolic language, where sky events are associated with intention, emotion, or will. There is also a biological dimension to this memory formation. Human brains are highly sensitive to high intensity, low-frequency events, especially those involving sudden sensory overload followed by environmental change. Lightning combines visual shock, auditory delay, and physical consequence into a single experience. This makes it exceptionally memorable compared to most other natural phenomena. In environments where lightning is frequent, these memories may become layered. One strike is not isolated from another. Instead, they form a chain of experiences that reinforce behavioral adaptation. A group that survives multiple storm seasons develops a more refined sense of atmospheric reading, even if the underlying cause remains unknown. This is not knowledge in the abstract sense, but survival intelligence embedded in routine behavior. Interestingly, some modern anthropological studies of oral traditions in historically storm-prone regions suggest that lightning often appears in foundational narratives of danger or transformation. While these traditions are far removed in time from prehistoric origins, they may preserve echoes of deep ancestral experiences where sky-based destruction played a formative role in shaping cultural memory. Another subtle but important detail lies in how lightning affects the perception of time. Because the flash is instantaneous but the thunder delayed, early humans experience a disjunction between cause and effect that unfolds across seconds. This creates a temporal gap that is unlike most other natural events. Over repeated exposure, this gap becomes familiar but never fully predictable. The mind learns that the world can act first and explain itself later. In some ecological contexts, lightning also introduces variability into resource availability. Fires triggered by strikes can clear dense vegetation, opening space for new plant growth. Animals may return to these areas in large numbers during regrowth phases, creating temporary hunting opportunities. Even without understanding ecological cycles, early humans may begin to associate post-storm landscapes with both danger and potential abundance. This duality does not erase fear, it complicates it. Lightning remains dangerous, but its consequences are no longer purely negative. It reshapes terrain in ways that sometimes benefit human survival indirectly. However, in this stage of cognition, such complexity is not conceptualized. The sky remains unpredictable, and unpredictability itself is the dominant impression. As generations pass, these remembered strikes become part of a larger environmental awareness system. The sky is not just weather. It is a source of repeated transformation that must be continuously read, interpreted, and responded to. Lightning, in this evolving memory structure, becomes one of the earliest anchors of that awareness, a force that ensures the sky is never ignored. Animals react before humans understand. Before early humans ever develop structured explanations for lightning, the natural world around them is already responding to it in ways that suggest anticipation. Long before the flash appears across the sky, the landscape begins to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Animals grow restless, movement patterns change, silence spreads through places that were moments earlier filled with routine activity. For early human observers, these changes become one of the first indirect clues that something powerful is approaching from above. In prehistoric ecosystems, animal behavior is one of the most reliable sources of environmental information. Humans, still deeply embedded within these ecosystems rather than separated from them, depend on reading these signals to survive. Herd animals that suddenly cluster tightly, birds that drop from open flight into dense cover, insects that vanish into soil or vegetation, all of these responses occur before the sky visibly changes. Lightning itself has not yet appeared, but its associated storm systems are already altering atmospheric pressure, humidity, and electromagnetic conditions in ways that many species are sensitive to. Modern biology confirms that many animals can detect changes in barometric pressure and low-frequency sound vibrations produced by distant storms. Some species also respond to infrasound generated by large atmospheric disturbances long before humans can perceive any change. While early humans would not understand these mechanisms, they would clearly observe the effect animals behaving as if danger is already present. This creates a profound interpretive challenge in early human cognition. If the sky is still visually calm but animals are reacting with urgency, then something unseen must already be in motion. The world appears to contain layers of awareness that humans are only partially able to access. Lightning, when it finally arrives, seems less like an isolated event and more like the culmination of a process that the rest of nature has already detected. In many reconstructed behavioral models of early human groups, observation of animals becomes an early warning system for storms. A sudden quiet in bird populations, or the abrupt retreat of grazing herds, may signal that shelter is needed even before clouds visibly darken. Over time, these observations are reinforced through repeated survival experiences. Groups that respond quickly to animal cues are more likely to avoid direct exposure to storms and lightning strikes, embedding this behavior into collective memory. Yet even with this adaptation, lightning itself remains unpredictable in timing and location. Animals may respond to the broader storm system, but the exact moment of electrical discharge cannot be anticipated. This creates a layered experience of awareness, one level of prediction based on environmental cues, and another level of absolute uncertainty governed by lightning's sudden appearance. When the strike finally occurs, it often feels disconnected from the preceding behavioral warnings. The storm may already be present, rain beginning to fall, wind shifting through trees, yet the lightning still arrives as a separate, intensified moment. This separation reinforces its psychological impact. It is not simply part of the storm, it is the storm's most extreme expression. There is also an important spatial dimension to how animals and humans experience lightning. Open landscapes, where visibility is wide but shelter is scarce, become especially dangerous during storms. Animals often move toward denser terrain in such conditions, seeking cover not only from rain but from exposure. Early humans likely mirror this behavior, even without understanding the precise cause. The instinct to move toward enclosed spaces during storms becomes reinforced through observation of animal movement. In forested environments, the interaction between lightning and animals becomes even more dramatic. A strike igniting a tree can trigger cascading movement across species. Birds flush from nests, mammals flee through undergrowth, and predators adjust hunting behavior in response to sudden fire. The entire ecosystem reacts in a chain of disturbance that begins with a single discharge from the sky. For early human observers, this reinforces the impression that lightning is not just an isolated phenomenon, but a trigger for widespread environmental disruption. One lesser-known ecological detail is that some species may actually benefit from lightning-induced fires in the long term. Certain plants require fire to release seeds or clear competition, and grazing animals often return to burned areas where new growth is more nutritious. However, this ecological renewal cycle unfolds over time, spans far beyond immediate human perception. In the moment of lightning and fire, only destruction is visible. This gap between short-term devastation and long-term renewal remains unknown to early humans. Their interpretation is shaped entirely by immediate sensory experience: the flash, the sound, the fire, and the scattering of life. Animals, in this sense, act as intermediaries between storm systems and human understanding, translating atmospheric shifts into visible behavior. Over generations, this relationship deepens into a form of environmental reading that is both practical and intuitive. Early humans become increasingly skilled at interpreting subtle animal cues as indicators of incoming storms. This skill does not eliminate the danger of lightning, but it reduces exposure time, allowing groups to seek shelter more effectively before conditions worsen. Still, the core mystery remains unresolved. Animals respond before humans understand, but neither group controls what follows. Lightning retains its independence. It is not predicted by behavior in any precise way, nor is it prevented by awareness. Even when the ecosystem signals danger in advance, the exact moment of sky discharge remains beyond anticipation. This reinforces a central tension in early human experience: the world is readable, but not controllable. Lightning sits at the center of that tension, acting as both confirmation of environmental awareness and reminder of its limits. The sky can be watched, the animals can be read, the air can be felt, but the strike itself belongs to a domain that resists all preparation. The night the forest split open. The storm arrives without ceremony, as it always does in the deep prehistoric world. The sky has already darkened, not with the gentle dimming of evening, but with something heavier, denser, as if light itself is being compressed upward into unseen layers of cloud. Wind moves through the forest in uneven pulses, bending branches and stirring leaves that should be still. The air carries a charged weight, the kind that presses against skin and makes even the most routine movements feel slightly uncertain. Early human groups in this environment do not yet have fire under full control. Their shelters are temporary woven structures of branches and hides, shallow cave mouths, or natural overhangs along riverbanks. They're close enough to the land to remain vulnerable to everything it produces, including the sudden violence of storms. On nights like this, the forest does not feel like a collection of living things. It feels like a single vast organism holding its breath. Then the first lightning strike arrives. It does not announce itself in advance. There is no gradual build-up that can be isolated in the moment. One instant the forest is dark, shaped only by faint outlines and shifting silhouettes. The next, the The sky fractures open with an intensity that seems to erase distance itself. For a fraction of a second, everything is visible in impossible clarity, every branch, every ridge of bark, every curve of uneven ground before reality collapses back into darkness. The sound follows, delayed but overwhelming. Thunder is not just noise, it is pressure moving through the air, rolling across the landscape in waves that seem to travel through bone as much as through space. The delay between flash and sound creates a disorienting sequence. The world is seen being destroyed before it is heard acknowledging the destruction. Somewhere within the illuminated forest, a tree is struck. The impact is not subtle. Heat travels through the trunk faster than the material can respond. Moisture inside the wood flashes into steam. Bark splits outward along natural weaknesses in the grain. In an instant, a living structure that may have stood for centuries is transformed into something fractured and burning. Pieces of it are thrown outward, and fire begins not as a slow spread but as a sudden birth. To early human observers, this is not a chain of physical processes. It is an event of absolute transformation. A stable object becomes unstable. A living presence becomes broken light and flame. The forest itself seems to react, not as individual trees and animals, but as a unified body responding to injury. What makes this moment especially powerful in early human perception is its scale of disruption. Lightning does not only affect what it strikes directly. The shock of it spreads outward through the environment. Animals scatter in all directions. Birds erupt from branches even where they are not directly threatened. Smaller creatures vanish into soil or undergrowth. Even the wind seems to shift in response, as if the atmosphere itself is unsettled. Fire begins to spread from the struck tree, catching dry material nearby. In some environments, especially those shaped by seasonal dryness, this can escalate quickly. The forest becomes a shifting field of movement and light burning fragments. Collapsing branches, fleeing animals, and shifting shadows created by intermittent illumination from continuing storm flashes. For early humans witnessing such an event, there is no separation between natural process and catastrophic change. The forest is not burning because of combustion. It is changing state because something from above has acted upon it. This sky has intervened in the structure of the land. One detail that would have been especially striking is the unpredictability of repetition. Lightning does not strike once and stop. It can return again and again within the same storm, sometimes hitting multiple locations across a landscape in a short span of time. This creates a sense that the sky is not releasing energy once, but engaging in a series of deliberate actions. Each strike feels like another decision made above. In modern understanding, this is simply atmospheric charge redistribution across storm systems. But in early perception, repetition reinforces intention. If something acts more than once, it is not random, it is persistent. The forest after such an event is altered in multiple ways. Burned sections create openings in dense vegetation. Charcoal and ash settle into soil. Animal paths shift as survivors move away from affected zones. Even without understanding ecological succession, early humans would recognize that the landscape has been rearranged. There is also the psychological imprint. Places where lightning has struck once are likely remembered as places where it can strike again. The memory of the forest splitting open becomes attached not only to the moment itself but to the location. Geography begins to carry warning. In some reconstructed behavioral interpretations, groups may avoid returning to heavily struck areas during storm seasons. even if those areas later become resource-rich due to regrowth. The memory of instantaneous destruction outweighs the slower benefits of ecological renewal. Yet within this violence, something else is also being shaped attention. Lightning forces awareness upward. It interrupts ground-based perception and imposes a connection between sky and land that cannot be ignored. The forest, usually experienced horizontally through movement and terrain, is suddenly linked vertically to the atmosphere above it. This vertical relationship becomes one of the earliest and most powerful conceptual frameworks in human experience. The idea that the sky can act upon the ground in direct, immediate ways, not gradually, not symbolically, but physically, in a single moment of transformation. And so the forest that splits open in the night is more than a scene of destruction. It is a turning point in perception, a reminder that the world is not stable, not layered in predictable cause and effect, but capable of sudden reconfiguration from forces that descend without warning. Birth of sky-based supernatural thought. After the forest splits open and the land is briefly rewritten by fire and impact, something subtle begins to shift in human perception. It is not a sudden invention of belief, nor a structured idea forming overnight. Instead, it is the slow accumulation of unanswered experience. Lightning does not behave like anything on the ground. It arrives without approach, acts without contact, and leaves consequences that seem too precise to be accidental. Over time, this creates a cognitive space where explanation struggles to keep up with observation. Early human minds are not yet divided between natural and supernatural categories. That separation comes much later in human history. At this stage, there is only what is seen, what is felt, and what is inferred when lightning strikes repeatedly across seasons, always from above, always beyond control. It begins to occupy a mental category defined not by physics, but by exception. It is not like wind, not like rain, not like animal movement. It is something else entirely. In many reconstructed anthropological models, this something else is the foundation upon which early sky-based supernatural thinking develops. The sky is already vast, distant, and unreachable. It contains the sun, the moon, and shifting patterns of light that govern time itself. When lightning appears within this domain, it brings violence into a space already associated with authority and scale. The result is a natural extension of interpretation. If the sky governs light and time, perhaps it also governs force. This does not mean early humans immediately formed structured religions or defined deities. Rather, they begin to attribute agency to the sky as a whole. The sky becomes a field of potential intention. Lightning is one of its most dramatic expressions, but not necessarily its only one. Storms, winds, and sudden changes in weather all contribute to this sense that above the world lies a domain capable of action. What makes lightning especially important in this development is its immediacy. Rain builds slowly, wind shifts gradually, but lightning acts in a single moment. That moment becomes a psychological anchor. It is easier for the mind to assign agency to sudden events than to gradual processes, especially when those events produce clear and irreversible consequences. In environments where lightning is frequent, this association strengthens. A single strike that kills a tree or ignites a field is enough to imprint a lasting memory. When similar events occur across years, the pattern reinforces itself. The sky is not passive, it is active, and its activity is not predictable. Some early human groups may begin to develop proto-symbolic associations with storm conditions. Dark clouds gathering on the horizon are not just weather. They are the visible presence of something approaching. Wind shifts are not just atmospheric movement. They are signs of transition. Lightning becomes the visible expression of that transition's most extreme form. It is important to emphasize that this is not yet mythology in a formal sense. It is perception layered with memory. But within that layering, the seeds of later mythological systems are already present. Across many future cultures, lightning will be associated with sky beings, judgment forces, or powerful natural spirits. These later interpretations likely echo this early cognitive stage where the sky is perceived as an active domain. Modern cognitive science offers some insight into why lightning plays such a strong role in this shift. Human brains are highly sensitive to agency detection, an evolutionary trait that favors survival by assuming intent behind ambiguous stimuli. A rustle in the grass may be interpreted as a predator. A sudden flash in the sky, followed by destruction, triggers the same interpretive mechanism but on a vastly larger scale. In the absence of explanatory frameworks, the mind does not default to randomness, it defaults to causation. Lightning, therefore, becomes one of the earliest and most powerful triggers for assigning unseen cause to natural events. Archaeological interpretation cannot directly recover these mental states, but indirect evidence supports their plausibility. The persistence of sky-associated symbolic systems in much later human cultures suggests that the sky has long been a central axis of interpretation. Lightning, as one of the most dramatic sky events, would naturally occupy a foundational role in this axis. There is also a practical dimension to this emerging interpretation. If the sky is capable of acting, then it is also something to be read. Storm patterns become meaningful. The behavior of animals during atmospheric shifts gains interpretive weight. Environmental awareness becomes not just survival skill, but a form of reading a larger system of signals. Even without formal belief structures, this creates a feedback loop between observation and interpretation. Lightning strikes reinforce the idea of sky agency. Sky agency increases attention to atmospheric cues. Increased attention leads to better survival responses during storms. Over generations, this loop becomes embedded in behavior and memory. Yet uncertainty remains at the center of it all. No interpretation fully contains lightning. It does not obey patterns that can be reliably mapped. It does not respond to human action. It does not offer warning in a consistent form. This unresolved quality is what allows it to remain open to interpretation for so long. In this early stage of human thought, lightning is not yet a symbol. It is an experience that resists closure. And in resisting closure, it opens the space in which sky-based meaning begins to form. Survival patterns after lightning fires. After the immediate violence of a lightning strike fades, what remains is not silence, but transformation. The forest does not return to its previous state. Burned trees stand as skeletal outlines against the sky. Patches of ground are blackened and warm. The air carries the lingering scent of ash mixed with damp earth. For early human groups moving cautiously back into these spaces, the landscape feels both familiar and fundamentally altered. Survival in this environment depends on reading change faster than danger reappears. Lightning itself is unpredictable, but its consequences are not. Fire spreads along dry vegetation, avoids wet ground, and reshapes movement pathways for animals. Early humans begin to recognize that storm-affected landscapes follow different rules than untouched ones. Even without abstract reasoning, They learn that certain environmental conditions now carry residual risk. One of the earliest survival patterns likely to emerge is temporal avoidance. After witnessing lightning-induced fires, groups may delay returning to struck areas until rain or time has reduced heat and instability. This is not a formal rule, but a learned caution reinforced by experience. Burned zones can conceal unstable branches, hidden embers, or displaced wildlife, all of which introduce new hazards. In some cases, lightning fires create temporary ecological openings that attract animals once regrowth begins. New plant shoots often emerge after fire clears competing vegetation, and herbivores may eventually return in greater numbers. Early humans, closely observing these cycles over generations, may begin to associate burned landscapes with future hunting opportunities. However, this understanding is gradual and uneven. Immediate memory is dominated by destruction, not renewal. Movement patterns also shift in response to storm history. Areas known to have experienced frequent lightning strikes may be avoided during certain seasons, especially when atmospheric conditions resemble those preceding earlier storms. Elevated ridges, isolated tall trees, and exposed clearings become less desirable during unstable weather periods. Instead, groups favor sheltered valleys, dense forest cover, or rock formations that offer partial protection from both rain and electrical exposure. One important but often overlooked detail in ecological survival behavior is how lightning reshapes animal distribution after storms. Species that flee burned areas temporarily alter migration routes, which in turn affects predator-prey dynamics. Early humans, positioned within these systems, must adapt quickly to shifting resource availability. Hunting grounds that were reliable before a storm may become temporarily empty, while new concentrations of animals appear elsewhere. This constant reshaping of the environment reinforces a core survival principle: stability is temporary. Lightning acts as a force that accelerates environmental change, compressing ecological transitions that might otherwise occur slowly over years into events that unfold in minutes or hours. For early humans, this compression makes the world feel less predictable and more responsive to forces beyond their control. Fire itself becomes a central element in this adaptation process. Even before full mastery of controlled fire use, humans begin to recognize its secondary effects. Burned landscapes are easier to traverse in some cases due to cleared vegetation, but also more exposed. Charcoal deposits retain heat long after visible flames are gone, creating hidden dangers on the ground. The terrain becomes layered with invisible risks. Over time, repeated exposure to lightning-initiated fires contributes to a growing awareness of seasonal patterns. Certain times of year bring more storms, especially in regions where temperature and humidity shifts create unstable atmospheric conditions. Early humans begin to align movement and settlement patterns with these broader environmental rhythms, not because they understand meteorology, but because survival depends on anticipating recurring risk. There is also a psychological adaptation taking place. The shock of lightning gradually becomes less paralyzing and more integrated into environmental awareness. While the fear never disappears, it becomes structured. Storms are no longer purely unexpected. They are conditions that can be anticipated in a general sense, even if the exact moment of lightning cannot be predicted. Yet unpredictability remains the defining feature. A landscape may remain untouched for hours under heavy storm clouds, only to be transformed in an instant by a single strike. This imbalance between expectation and outcome ensures that lightning retains its psychological weight even as survival strategies improve. In some reconstructed behavioral interpretations, groups may even begin to use storm aftermath strategically. Freshly burned areas can reveal animals displaced from cover, making them temporarily easier to track. However, this potential advantage is always balanced by residual danger. The environment has not stabilized. It has simply shifted into a new, unstable phase. What emerges from this is a more complex relationship with the sky. It is no longer only a source of threat. It is also a force that reshapes opportunity, movement, and resource distribution. Lightning, as its most intense expression, sits at the center of this duality. It destroys, but it also indirectly reorganizes the conditions of survival. Even so, early humans never experienced this as balance. They experience it as disruption followed by adaptation. The sky acts, the land changes, life adjusts, and within that cycle, lightning remains the moment when change is most absolute, most immediate, and most impossible to ignore. Evidence, hidden in charred ground layers. Long after storms pass and forests regrow, the most enduring traces of lightning are not found in the sky or even in the visible landscape, but buried beneath it. Layers of soil, ash, and sediment accumulate slowly over time, quietly preserving records of ancient disturbance. To early humans, these layers are invisible, but to modern archaeology and geology, they become one of the most important archives for reconstructing a world where lightning repeatedly reshaped the environment. In prehistoric ecosystems, especially those prone to seasonal storms, lightning is one of the most consistent natural ignition sources. When a strike hits dry vegetation, it can produce intense but localized burning. Over repeated as vents across centuries and millennia, these burns leave behind charcoal deposits embedded in soil. These deposits do not announce their origin, but they carry a signature of sudden heat and incomplete combustion that distinguishes them from slower environmental processes. What makes these layers particularly significant is their repetition. In certain sediment cores taken from ancient floodplains, savannas, and forest margins, researchers find alternating bands of organic material and charcoal-rich deposits. This pattern suggests cycles of growth, burning, and regrowth cycles consistent with environments frequently affected by lightning-driven fires. While not every layer can be definitively attributed to lightning, it remains one of the most plausible natural contributors in many contexts, where volcanic activity or human fire use cannot fully explain the evidence. Early humans, of course, do not read soil. They read the surface world, but they live upon these accumulating records without knowing it. Every burned landscape they encounter is part of a longer sequence stretching far beyond human memory. A valley that appears scorched may have been burned dozens of times before in ways that left no visible trace above ground, except subtle differences in vegetation regrowth. One of the lesser-known aspects of lightning's environmental impact is its ability to influence soil chemistry. High-intensity heat can alter nutrient distribution, temporarily increasing the availability of certain minerals in the ground. Over time, this contributes to patchy fertility patterns across landscapes shaped by repeated fires. While early humans cannot detect chemical changes, they may still notice that certain burned areas eventually support different plant growth than surrounding regions. This creates a subtle feedback loop between destruction and renewal that is embedded in the land itself. Lightning does not simply erase. It rearranges conditions for future life. But this long-term effect remains hidden beneath immediate perception. In the short term, What dominates experience is lost trees reduced to charcoal, hunting grounds disrupted, and familiar terrain transformed into unstable ground. Archaeologists studying ancient fire regimes often distinguish between anthropogenic fire-controlled or intentional burning and natural fire caused by environmental sources such as lightning. In periods before widespread fire control, natural ignition would have played a dominant role in shaping fire frequency. This means that many of the earliest fire layers in the geological record likely contain the indirect signature of lightning strikes that occurred long before humans learned to produce fire themselves. There is also a spatial pattern hidden in these layers. Lightning does not strike evenly across landscapes. It is more frequent in certain environmental zones, elevated terrain, transitional climate regions, and areas where atmospheric instability is highest. Over time, this produces uneven distributions of charcoal deposits in the geological record. Some regions show repeated burning events, while others remain relatively untouched for long periods. Early humans living within these varied landscapes would have experienced lightning not as a uniform force but as a localized presence. Certain areas would feel more active during storm seasons, even if the underlying reason was not understood. These perceptions may later influence migration routes and seasonal movement patterns, reinforcing the connection between environmental reading and survival strategy. Another important detail preserved in charred layers is the speed of transformation. Unlike slow ecological processes, lightning-driven fires create abrupt transitions between states. Vegetation shifts from living to burned within moments. Soil temperature spikes rapidly and then cools. Organic material is partially preserved in charcoal form rather than fully decomposed. This rapid transition leaves behind a geological signature that contrasts sharply with gradual environmental change. Over time, these signatures accumulate into a long-term archive of atmospheric instability, even without direct observation. The land itself records the frequency of violent sky events. What early humans experience as isolated moments of destruction is, in geological terms, part of a continuous pattern extending across deep time. There is also a psychological dimension to this hidden evidence. Even if it is only reconstructed through modern interpretation, knowing that landscapes carry memory of repeated lightning strikes adds another layer to understanding early human fear and adaptation. The ground beneath them is not static. It is shaped by recurring forces that operate beyond perception. In some regions, repeated burning events may even contribute to the formation of distinct ecological zones adapted to fire. Certain plant species evolve traits that allow them to survive or even depend on periodic burning. While this evolutionary adaptation unfolds over extremely long timescales, it begins with repeated ignition sources, many of which can be traced back to lightning activity. Thus, beneath the visible story of storms and survival lies a quieter archive written in carbon, ash, and altered soil structure. It is a record that early humans cannot read, yet constantly inhabit. Every step across the ground is a step across the remnants of past sky violence, layered and preserved in the earth itself. Lightning, in this sense, does not only shape moments, it builds history into the ground, competing interpretations of sky force. As lightning continues to mark the early human world with sudden destruction and transformation, something subtle begins to emerge in how different groups perceive it. Even without formal systems of knowledge, variation in interpretation appears naturally across regions, environments, and generations. Lightning is always the same physical event, but its meaning is never fixed. It shifts depending on memory, experience, and survival context. In some groups, lightning is primarily remembered through loss. These are communities that have witnessed repeated fires destroying hunting grounds, shelters, or travel routes. For them, the sky is associated with interruption and danger. This strike is not just a moment of force, but a disruption in continuity. In others, where lightning-induced fires occasionally clear dense vegetation and reveal new movement patterns of animals, the memory is more complex. The sky is still dangerous, but it is also indirectly connected to opportunity. This divergence in interpretation becomes the earliest form of what modern anthropology might recognize as competing explanatory frameworks, not in the structured sense of philosophy or religion, but in the basic human need to assign meaning to repeated phenomena that cannot be controlled. Lightning, because of its visibility and impact, becomes one of the most contested natural events in early cognitive development. It is experienced universally, but understood locally. Each group builds its own pattern of association based on frequency, intensity, and outcome of exposure. In regions with frequent storms, lightning becomes almost a seasonal expectation, embedded into behavioral routines. In more stable climates, it remains a rare and shocking anomaly, remembered more intensely because of its scarcity. Modern scholars examining early symbolic systems often note that natural forces like storms and fire tend to occupy central positions in early mythic structures across cultures. While these later systems are far removed in time from prehistoric lightning encounters, they likely preserve echoes of this early interpretive diversity. The sky, as a domain of uncontrollable power, becomes a shared conceptual space into which different meanings are projected. One of the most important factors shaping interpretation is the unpredictability of lightning distribution. Unlike rain, which can be observed building and spreading across regions, lightning appears selectively. One valley may experience repeated strikes while another nearby remains untouched. This unevenness reinforces the idea that the sky does not act uniformly. Instead, it seems to choose locations, even if that perception is entirely driven by atmospheric conditions invisible to early observers. This selective experience contributes to a growing sense that lightning is not simply a mechanical process. It appears to have preference or focus, even though no such mechanism exists. The human mind, seeking patterns in uncertainty, fills this gap with meaning. At the same time, practical survival knowledge continues to develop alongside interpretation. Groups that learn to read storm formations more accurately tend to avoid direct exposure to lightning strikes. Over generations, this produces subtle differences in survival success between communities that are more attentive to atmospheric cues and those that are less responsive. These differences reinforce behavioral traditions, which in turn shape interpretation. In environments where lightning is frequent and intense, the sky may come to be viewed as a dominant environmental force. In more temperate regions, where storms are less dramatic, lightning may be perceived as a rare disruption rather than a defining feature of the world. These variations prevent any single interpretation from becoming universal during this early stage of human cognition. There is also an important emotional component that influences interpretation. Lightning produces a unique combination of fear and awe. Fear arises from its destructive capacity, its unpredictability, and its proximity to survival risk. Awe arises from its visual intensity and the sense that something vast and powerful is being briefly revealed. This dual emotional response makes lightning difficult to categorize purely as threat or neutral event. In some reconstructed behavioral interpretations, this emotional duality may contribute to early symbolic thinking about balance in natural forces. However, it is important not to project later conceptual systems too directly onto this stage. What exists here is not philosophy, but emotional imprint layered with survival experience. Another key factor is repetition over time. A single lightning strike might be interpreted as an isolated incident, but repeated exposure across seasons and generations forces the mind to incorporate it into a broader environmental model. Even if the exact cause is unknown, its presence becomes expected under certain conditions. This expectation does not reduce its impact, but it changes its cognitive status from anomaly to recurring feature of the sky. Despite all these variations in interpretation, one constant remains: lightning resists full explanation. It cannot be predicted with precision, controlled in any way, or prevented through behavior. This resistance ensures that no single interpretation can fully dominate. Instead, lightning remains a shared mystery experienced differently but never fully resolved. In this way, the Skyforce becomes one of the earliest natural phenomena to generate multiple layers of meaning within human groups, not because it demands interpretation, but because it refuses closure, lightning as a tool and threat. In the long unfolding relationship between early humans and the sky, lightning remains at first an event of pure disruption. It destroys without warning, reshapes landscapes in moments, and leaves behind fire that cannot be controlled or contained. Yet over time, something unexpected begins to emerge in the shadow of that destruction. Even without understanding its cause, humans begin to notice that lightning does not only erase it, also transforms conditions in ways that can occasionally be used. This realization is not immediate. It is not the result of deliberate insight. It comes from repeated exposure to environments that have been altered by storms. A burned forest is not the same as a living one. Movement becomes easier in cleared areas. Visibility increases. Animals behave differently when forced out of dense cover. In these indirect effects, early humans begin to encounter opportunities shaped by lightning's destructive path. One of the most significant indirect consequences of lightning is the creation of open hunting conditions. When fire spreads through vegetation, it drives animals into movement. Some flee unpredictably, while others cluster in remaining safe zones. For early human groups already skilled at tracking movement, these disruptions create temporary advantages. Prey becomes more visible, paths become more accessible, and the landscape itself becomes temporarily reorganized. However, this does not transform lightning into something beneficial in a conscious sense. The danger remains absolute. No group would intentionally seek lightning for its effects. Instead, what develops is a form of opportunistic adaptation. After storms pass, survivors return to altered environments and exploit the temporary conditions created by fire and displacement. In ecological terms, lightning acts as a disturbance force that resets portions of the environment. In fire-adapted ecosystems, this resetting is essential for long-term renewal. But early humans do not perceive long-term ecological cycles. They perceive immediate disruption followed by altered opportunity. The connection between destruction and later abundance remains implicit rather than understood. Another subtle effect of lightning-induced fires is the exposure of resources that were previously hidden. Burned vegetation can reveal edible plant shoots during regrowth phases. Charred animal remains may attract scavenging species. Certain mineral deposits become more visible in cleared terrain. Each of these changes contributes to a shifting resource map that early humans learn to navigate over time. Yet even as these indirect benefits emerge, the core identity of lightning remains unchanged. It is not a tool in any intentional sense. there is no control, no repetition, no reliability. A tool implies predictability and use. Lightning offers neither. It cannot be summoned, directed, or sustained. It arrives on its own terms and disappears just as quickly. This distinction is crucial in understanding early human cognition. Fire, once controlled, becomes a tool because it can be maintained, transported, and reproduced. Lightning, by contrast, is uncontrollable. Even when its effects are observed to be useful in hindsight, the source itself remains beyond reach. This keeps it firmly in the category of environmental force rather than technology. Still, the human mind does not easily separate cause from consequence. Over time, associations form between storm activity and environmental change. A burned valley that later becomes rich in game may be remembered not just for its abundance, but for the storm that preceded it. In memory, sequences compress. Lightning becomes indirectly linked to outcomes it did not intentionally create. This compression of memory is one of the subtle ways early humans begin to integrate lightning into broader environmental understanding. The sky is not only a source of danger, but also a trigger for cycles of change. Even without understanding weather systems, humans begin to recognize that certain atmospheric conditions lead to predictable environmental transformations. At the same time, caution never diminishes. The risk of direct exposure to lightning remains extreme. A single strike can end life instantly, making proximity during storms one of the most dangerous situations in the early human world. This reinforces a dual relationship. Lightning is both avoided and indirectly adapted to. In some reconstructed behavioral models, this duality may even influence movement timing. Groups may avoid traveling during peak storm seasons, or adjust daily activity patterns to minimize exposure during times when atmospheric instability is higher. These adaptations are not based on understanding lightning itself, but on accumulated experience of storm-associated risk. There is also a psychological layer to this relationship. Lightning's unpredictability ensures that even when its indirect effects are beneficial, it is never trusted. It is a force that can change from destructive to indirectly useful without warning, but it cannot be relied upon for either outcome. This instability prevents any stable categorization. Over long periods of time, lightning thus occupies a unique position in early human experience. It is neither purely enemy nor ally. It is a force that reshapes the environment in ways that sometimes benefit survival, but always through destruction that cannot be controlled or repeated. In this tension lies one of the earliest examples of human adaptation to uncontrollable natural forces learning to use the aftermath of something that cannot itself be used. Migration driven by storm zones. Across deep prehistory, human movement is often imagined as a slow spread across continents driven by food, climate, and opportunity. But beneath this broad pattern lies a more subtle influence, one shaped not only by long-term environmental shifts, but by the immediate violence of the sky. In regions where lightning is frequent and storms intense, the rhythm of survival is altered in ways that gradually affect where people choose to stay and where they choose to leave. Lightning itself does not create permanent barriers. A single strike changes nothing about geography in a lasting structural sense. But repeated storms over seasons and generations create something more influential: zones of unpredictability. Certain valleys, ridges, and forest edges become associated with sudden fire, scattered animal movement, and environmental disruption. Even without understanding the atmospheric reasons, early humans begin to recognize patterns of risk embedded in place. In this way, Migration is not only a response to resource availability, but also to perceived environmental stability. A region that repeatedly experiences violent storms during certain seasonal windows becomes less attractive for long-term settlement, not because it is empty of resources, but because its reliability is interrupted by forces that cannot be anticipated or controlled. Modern climate science helps reconstruct how these patterns may have appeared. Lightning frequency is strongly influenced by regional atmospheric conditions, humidity levels, temperature gradients, and topographical features. Mountainous regions and transitional climate zones often experience higher storm activity. River basins with strong seasonal heating can also generate frequent electrical storms. These are precisely the kinds of environments early humans inhabited, drawn by water, game, and ecological diversity. The result is a paradox. The most resource-rich areas are often also the most unstable in terms of atmospheric activity. Over time, this creates a subtle pressure on movement. Groups that experience repeated storm disruptions in a given region may gradually shift their seasonal routes, avoiding peak storm periods or relocating entirely to adjacent zones with lower atmospheric volatility. It is important to emphasize that this is not a deliberate conceptual migration driven by understanding of lightning. It is an emergent pattern formed through accumulated experience. A group does not decide this place has too much lightning. Instead, they remember too many moments of sudden fire, disrupted hunting, or dangerous exposure, and those memories influence future decisions in quiet but persistent ways. In this sense, lightning acts as a hidden architect of movement, not by directly blocking paths, but by reshaping the perceived safety of landscapes over time. There is also a cascading ecological effect that reinforces this pattern. When lightning ignites fires in certain zones, animal populations shift in response. Some species move temporarily away from burned areas, while others return during regrowth phases. Predators follow prey. Scavengers follow fire zones. The entire food web becomes mobile in response to storm-induced disturbance. Early humans, embedded within this system, are carried along by these shifting distributions. Over generations, these movements begin to form broader migration corridors, not fixed routes, but flexible pathways that adjust according to environmental conditions. Areas with frequent storm activity may become transitional rather than permanent zones of occupation. Meanwhile, regions with lower lightning incidents may serve as more stable seasonal anchors. One subtle but important detail in this process is the role of memory compression. Human groups do not retain every storm event with equal clarity. Instead, extreme moments such as a tree splitting nearby or a fire forcing sudden relocation become symbolic anchors for entire periods of time. These anchors influence future decision-making far more than routine experiences of rain or wind. As a result, migration patterns are disproportionately shaped by rare but high-impact events. Lightning strikes, though statistically infrequent compared to other weather phenomena, leave disproportionately strong cognitive impressions. This imbalance ensures that their influence on movement is greater than their frequency alone would suggest. In some reconstructed interpretations, this may contribute to a form of environmental caution that becomes embedded in cultural memory. Certain landscapes may be remembered not just for what they provide, but for what they unpredictably take away. Over time, this creates a layered geography of familiarity and avoidance, where storm history subtly shapes human presence. Even so, no landscape is ever fully abandoned due to lightning alone. Human survival depends on following resources, not avoiding all risk. Instead, What emerges is a balancing act between opportunity and unpredictability. Lightning becomes one of several forces that must be accounted for in this balancing process, alongside drought, predation, and seasonal change. What makes storm zones particularly influential is their unpredictability over short timescales. A region may remain calm for weeks or months, then suddenly experience intense storm activity. This irregularity prevents full adaptation. Unlike seasonal patterns that can be reliably anticipated, lightning storms resist precise forecasting in early human perception, reinforcing their role as intermittent disruptors of settlement stability. In this way, lightning does not determine where humans go, but it subtly influences how long they remain in one place. It adds a layer of instability to otherwise viable environments, shaping migration not through direct force, but through accumulated memory of disruption. Across vast stretches of time, these small adjustments in movement contribute to broader patterns of human dispersal. The world is gradually mapped not only by resources and terrain, but by the invisible imprint of storm activity etched into collective experience. Myths born from real strikes. Long before stories are written down, they begin as repeated impressions shaped by experience, memory, and fear. Lightning, with its sudden arrival and overwhelming force, becomes one of the earliest natural phenomena to leave behind the kind of psychological imprint that eventually evolves into narrative. Not yet myth in the formal sense, but something closer to patterned memory turned into meaning. In early human groups, storytelling is not separated from survival knowledge. It is how experience is preserved across generations. A strike that kills a tree is not simply remembered as an isolated event. It becomes part of a shared understanding of how the world behaves. Over time, as similar events accumulate, the mind begins to connect them into sequences that feel larger than any single occurrence. The sky, already associated with distance and authority, becomes the central stage for these interpretations. Lightning, because of its visibility and force, becomes the most memorable expression of that sky. It is not surprising, then, that across widely separated regions and later cultures, lightning often appears in stories involving powerful sky forces, judgment, or unseen beings. These later narratives are far removed from prehistoric cognition, but they likely echo the same foundational experience, the sky acting in ways that reshape the ground instantly. It is important not to project fully formed mythology into this early stage. There are no structured pantheons, no formal rituals tied specifically to lightning in the way later societies would develop. Instead, there are fragments associations built from repeated exposure, a storm that destroys a shelter, a fire that clears a hunting area, a night where animals vanish into silence before the sky flashes open. These fragments accumulate into narrative potential. One of the most powerful mechanisms driving this transformation is emotional intensity. Lightning is not a neutral event. It produces fear, awe, and sensory overload in a single moment. The human brain tends to preserve high emotion experiences more strongly than routine ones. As a result, lightning events are more likely to be remembered, retold, and reshaped in transmission. Over generations, retelling introduces variation. A strike near a group becomes a strike that came down from the sky and chose the tree. A fire that spreads after a storm becomes a burning sent from above. These linguistic shifts are not deliberate inventions of belief, but natural consequences of storytelling, under conditions where precision is less important than meaning. Environmental context also plays a role. In regions where lightning is frequent, repeated exposure allows for more structured interpretation. In regions where it is rare, a single dramatic event may carry disproportionate narrative weight, becoming a defining memory for an entire generation. Both conditions produce pathways towards symbolic interpretation, but through different mechanisms. Another subtle factor is the timing of lightning relative to human activity. Strikes that occur near campsites, travel routes, or hunting grounds are more likely to be remembered than those occurring in unobserved wilderness. This proximity to human life increases the sense that lightning is not random, but directed towards spaces of importance. Even though this perception is not accurate in a physical sense, it becomes psychologically meaningful. Modern cognitive anthropology suggests that humans are naturally inclined to infer agency in high-impact, low-frequency events. Lightning fits this category perfectly. It is rare enough to stand out, powerful enough to demand attention, and unpredictable enough to resist simple explanation. These characteristics make it a strong candidate for early symbolic interpretation. As time progresses, these interpretations begin to stabilize into recurring narrative themes. The sky becomes a source of power that can strike the earth. Fire becomes a consequence of that power. Trees, mountains, and open fields become points of interaction between skyforce and ground life. These themes, while not yet formal mythology, lay the structural foundation for later symbolic systems. It is also important to recognize that not all interpretations are purely fearful. In some reconstructed traditions, lightning may also be associated with renewal due to its connection with fire and landscape change. A burned forest eventually gives way to new growth. This duality, destruction followed by renewal, adds complexity to early narrative framing, even if not fully understood as a cycle. However, the dominant emotional tone remains one of awe mixed with caution. Lightning is not predictable enough to be trusted, nor controlled enough to be approached. It exists outside the boundaries of normal interaction with the environment. This separation is what allows it to become symbolically significant in later cultural evolution. What survives across all interpretations is the same core observation. Something in the sky acts upon the earth in ways that are immediate, absolute, and irreversible. From this observation, stories begin to form, and from stories, meaning begins to grow. Lightning does not need to be understood for it to become mythologized. It only needs to be remembered. The long adaptation to electric skies. Over vast stretches of time, the relationship between humans and lightning shifts from pure shock to something more layered and integrated. The sky does not become less dangerous, and lightning does not become less powerful, but human perception gradually adjusts to its presence. What once felt like an absolute rupture in reality begins to be folded into a broader understanding of environmental patterns, even if those patterns remain only partially grasped. This adaptation does not come from a single discovery. It emerges from accumulated experience across countless generations. Storms are endured, landscapes are revisited after fire, and survival continues despite repeated encounters with skyborne destruction. Slowly, the human mind stops treating lightning as an isolated anomaly and begins to place it within a larger framework of seasonal change, terrain variation, and atmospheric behavior. In regions where storms are frequent, this adaptation becomes especially pronounced. Groups learn, through repeated exposure, that certain visual and environmental cues tend to precede storm activity. Darkening horizons, shifts in wind direction, and changes in animal movement become part of an informal system of environmental reading. Lightning itself remains unpredictable, but the conditions surrounding it become increasingly familiar. This does not eliminate fear. Instead, fear becomes structured. It is no longer constant and undefined, but concentrated around specific conditions. The approach of a storm carries meaning. The absence of storms carries relief. Lightning, when it arrives, still carries its full intensity, but it is now framed within a recognized environmental sequence rather than appearing as a completely isolated rupture. One of the most significant changes during this long adaptation is spatial behavior. Early humans begin to refine their use of landscape features in response to storm exposure. Dense forests, cave systems, and low-lying sheltered areas gain importance during unstable weather periods. Open ridges and isolated high points become increasingly avoided when atmospheric conditions suggest storm development. These behaviors are not formally taught as rules, but transmitted through observation and survival outcomes. Another layer of adaptation occurs in movement timing. Groups gradually adjust their seasonal mobility patterns to reduce exposure during periods when lightning frequency is historically higher. Even without precise understanding of meteorology, repeated experience creates a form of environmental scheduling. Certain times of year become associated with heightened caution, while others are considered more stable for travel and resource gathering. Lightning also begins to influence attention in a more refined way. Instead of being perceived only at the moment of impact, it becomes part of a broader observational system. Humans learn to watch the sky more continuously, not in fear alone, but in anticipation of change. This sustained attention to atmospheric conditions represents an early form of environmental forecasting, grounded entirely in observation rather than explanation. Despite these adaptations, unpredictability remains central. No amount of experience allows precise prediction of where or when lightning will strike. A storm may pass harmlessly over one valley while devastating another nearby. This inconsistency ensures that lightning never becomes fully integrated into a controllable framework. It remains a force that can be partially prepared for, but never mastered. This tension between adaptation and unpredictability shapes much of early human cognition. The world becomes more readable, but never fully readable. Lightning sits at the center of this condition, acting as a reminder that some aspects of the environment resist complete interpretation. Over time, however, even unpredictability becomes familiar, not in the sense of being understood, but in the sense of being expected. Early humans come to know that the sky can change without warning. This expectation itself becomes a form of adaptation. It does not reduce the power of lightning, but it reduces its capacity to completely disorient. In this long process, something subtle occurs. Lightning shifts from being an absolute rupture in experience to being one of several recurring forces that define the boundaries of human interaction with the natural world. It remains extraordinary, but it's no longer outside the structure of lived experience. The sky is still electric. The ground is still vulnerable, but between them, human awareness has grown more attentive, more responsive, and more resilient. Adaptation does not erase danger. It creates a way to exist within it. And so, beneath the same unpredictable skies, a quieter transformation takes place, not in the lightning itself, but in the minds that learn, slowly and imperfectly, to live under it. When humans learn to predict storms, after countless generations of living beneath unstable skies, something subtle but profound begins to change in human perception. Lightning itself remains uncontrollable, unchanged in its suddenness and intensity, but the world around it slowly becomes more readable. The sky, once experienced as pure unpredictability, begins to reveal patterns never complete, never precise, but consistent enough to shape anticipation. This shift does not come from a single breakthrough. It emerges from the slow accumulation of observation across lifetimes. Early humans repeatedly witnessed that lightning rarely appears in isolation. It is part of larger atmospheric conditions, dark cloud formations, rising winds, shifts in humidity, and the growing pressure that precedes storms. While none of these cues explain lightning, they consistently accompany it. Over time, association becomes a form of understanding. In regions where storms are frequent, especially near mountain ranges, coastal zones, or tropical transitional climates, this observational learning becomes more refined. Groups begin to recognize that certain skies carry a different quality of light, a heaviness that lingers before storms arrive. Animals react in advance. Wind patterns shift direction. Even distant horizons appear to compress under dense cloud systems. Lightning remains the most dramatic moment, but it is no longer entirely unexpected. This is not prediction in the modern scientific sense. It is anticipation built on pattern recognition without explanation. Early humans cannot calculate atmospheric pressure or map electrical charge, but they can recognize that certain conditions consistently precede certain outcomes. The sky becomes readable in fragments, even if it never becomes fully transparent. One of the most important developments in this stage is behavioral timing. Movement, hunting, gathering, and travel begin to align more closely with observed environmental cycles. Groups may choose to delay movement when the sky shows signs of instability, or accelerate travel when conditions appear calm. These decisions are not based on certainty, but on accumulated probability shaped by memory. Lightning, in this context, becomes less of an isolated terror and more of a peak event within a broader system of environmental signals. It is still feared, perhaps even more deeply, because of how clearly it now fits into recognizable storm structures, but it is no longer completely detached from expectation. The mind learns that the world has rhythms, even if those rhythms are irregular. Yet even as anticipation grows, the fundamental unpredictability of lightning remains intact. A storm may build and pass without a single strike. Another may erupt suddenly with multiple discharges in rapid succession. This inconsistency ensures that no level of observation ever becomes absolute knowledge. The sky can be read, but never mastered. This tension gives rise to one of the most important cognitive balances in early human development, the coexistence of knowledge and uncertainty. Humans learn enough to reduce exposure to danger, but never enough to eliminate it. Lightning enforces this boundary repeatedly, ensuring that adaptation remains partial. Over time, this partial understanding shapes not only behavior but perception itself. The sky is no longer just a space above. It becomes a system of signals, warnings, and transitions. Lightning is the most visible expression of that system's extreme end state, but it is now understood as part of a continuum rather than an isolated phenomenon. In a deeper sense, this marks a turning point in human relationship with nature. The environment is no longer experienced as purely chaotic, nor as fully predictable. It becomes structured but uncertain, and within that structure, lightning holds a unique position, the most sudden confirmation that even a readable world can still surprise. As generations pass, this awareness becomes embedded in survival intelligence. People do not need to understand the sky to respect its patterns. They only need to remember what has happened before. Lightning, through repetition and consequence, ensures that memory remains sharp. In the end, what emerges is not mastery over storms, but coexistence with them. Humans learn to live under electric skies by reading their language without ever fully speaking it back. Lightning remains unchanged, but humanity is not.